What if the universe isn't silent, but simply waiting for you to notice that it's aware? What if everything around you, the space, the patterns, the timing of events, isn't random at all, but part of something that sees, responds, and remembers? Have you ever had a moment where reality felt too precise, too perfectly timed to be coincidence? What if those moments aren't glitches, but signals? And here's the real question. What if you're not just living in the universe, but inside something that is, in some way, aware of you? There's a quiet assumption most of us carry without ever questioning it, that the universe is empty. Not empty of matter or energy or movement, but empty of awareness. We imagine space as vast, silent, indifferent, a backdrop where events unfold without intention. Stars burn, planets spin, atoms collide, and none of it, we assume, is aware of itself. Consciousness, we believe, is something rare, something fragile, something that appears only inside certain biological systems, brains specifically, and disappears the moment those systems fail. But what if that assumption is wrong? Not entirely wrong, but incomplete. What if consciousness is not something that emerges inside the universe, but something the universe itself expresses? This idea sounds abstract at first, maybe even impossible. But the more closely you look at reality, the harder it becomes to draw a clear line between what is aware and what is not. Let's start with something simple. Right now, you are aware. You're aware of these words, of your surroundings, of your own thoughts reacting to what you're hearing. That awareness feels personal, local, contained. It feels like it belongs to you. But where exactly does it come from? Neuroscience will tell you that consciousness arises from complex interactions between neurons in the brain, electrical signals firing, networks communicating, patterns forming. And that's true to a point. But here's the problem. No matter how detailed the explanation becomes, it never fully answers the core question. How does physical activity become experience? How does a pattern of electrical signals turn into the feeling of seeing, hearing, thinking? This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. And despite all our scientific progress, we still don't have a complete answer. Which leaves room for another possibility. What if consciousness doesn't originate in the brain? What if the brain doesn't produce awareness, but receives it, like a filter or a translator? A system that takes something fundamental and shapes it into a personal experience. If that were true, it would change everything, because it would mean that consciousness is not limited to living organisms. It would mean that awareness is not an exception in the universe, but a property of it. Now, before this starts to sound too mystical, consider something from physics. At the most fundamental level, reality behaves in ways that challenge our intuition. Particles don't exist in fixed states until they're observed. Instead, they exist as probabilities, possibilities. And when an observation occurs, those possibilities collapse into a single outcome. This is often called the observer effect. And while it doesn't necessarily mean that human consciousness creates reality, it does suggest something deeply strange. The act of observation is not separate from what is observed. In other words, the universe is not a fully independent system. It is, in some sense, relational, interactive. And that raises a subtle but powerful question. If observation plays a role in shaping reality, what exactly counts as an observer? Is it only human minds, animal awareness, or something more fundamental? Because if observation is required for reality to take form, then awareness might not be something that appears within the universe. It might be something the universe requires, something built into its structure. Now let's go deeper. There's a concept in philosophy called panpsychism. It suggests that consciousness is not limited to brains, but exists in some form in all matter. Not in the sense that everything is thinking or feeling the way humans do, but in the sense that awareness exists on a spectrum. At one end, you have simple forms of awareness, basic responsiveness, sensitivity to interaction. At the other end, you have complex, self-reflective consciousness, like yours. Under this view, the universe is not made of dead matter. It is made of something that has the potential for experience at every level. And complex systems, like the human brain, don't create consciousness. They amplify it, organize it, focus it. This idea is controversial, but it solves a problem that traditional models struggle with. It explains how consciousness can exist without suddenly appearing from nowhere. It removes the need for a sharp boundary between aware and not aware. Instead, it suggests continuity, a gradual increase in complexity. Now let's bring this back to your experience, because whether or not the universe is conscious in a literal sense, there are moments when it feels that way. Moments where the timing of events feels too precise, where patterns emerge in ways that seem almost intentional, where your thoughts, your attention, your internal state seem to align with what happens externally. These moments are often dismissed as coincidence, but they leave an impression, a feeling that something is connected, not controlled, but connected. And that feeling is worth examining, because even if the universe is not conscious in the way we understand it, your interaction with it creates the experience of meaning. You notice patterns, you assign significance, you connect events, and through that process, the world becomes something more than random. It becomes responsive. But here's where it gets interesting. That responsiveness may not be entirely subjective, because your actions influence the environment, your decisions change outcomes, your attention shapes what you notice, which shapes what you do next. This creates a loop, a feedback system, where internal states and external events influence each other continuously. And when that loop becomes strong enough, it can feel like the universe itself is participating. Not because it has intention, but because the interaction is so seamless that it appears intentional. However, there's another possibility, one that goes beyond perception and behavior. What if the universe is not conscious in the same way you are, but capable of something like awareness on a different scale? Not localized, not personal, but distributed. A kind of awareness that exists not in one place, but everywhere. In the relationships between things, in the structure of reality itself. This idea is difficult to grasp because it doesn't fit our usual categories. We think of consciousness as something that belongs to individuals, something that has a center, a point of view. But what if there are forms of awareness that don't have a center, that don't think but still respond, that don't observe from a single perspective but emerge from the total system? In that case, the universe wouldn't be conscious in the way you are, but it wouldn't be completely unconscious either. It would be something in between. Something that interacts, adapts, and evolves in ways that resemble awareness, without being identical to it. And if that's true, then your consciousness is not separate from the universe. It is part of the way the universe becomes aware of itself. Not the only way, but one instance of it, one perspective among many. This idea has appeared in different forms throughout history, in philosophy, in spirituality, in modern science, always with different language, different interpretations, but pointing towards the same possibility, that the boundary between mind and reality is not as clear as it seems, and that awareness may not be something you have, but something you participate in. Now let's consider what this means for how you experience your life. If the universe is completely unconscious, then everything that happens is purely mechanical, cause and effect, no meaning beyond what you assign. But if there is even the possibility that awareness exists beyond individual minds, then your experience is part of something larger, not controlled, not predetermined, but connected. Your thoughts don't just exist in isolation. They influence your actions. Your actions influence your environment. Your environment influences others, and those changes ripple outward in ways you can't fully trace. In that sense, your consciousness is already interacting with the universe, constantly, whether or not the universe itself is aware. But if it is, even in the slightest sense, then every moment becomes something more. Not because it's guided, but because it's part of a larger field of interaction, a system where awareness at different levels intersects. And that leads to one final question. Not whether the universe is conscious, but what it would mean if it were. Would it change how you see your life? Would it change how you interpret coincidence? Would it change